Okay, so we're gonna shift gears today and talk a little bit about maybe something that you haven't talked about as much yet in this class. And my voice kind of comes in and out, so if at any point I'm either talking too softly, please raise your hand, tell me to speak louder. Or if I'm talking too fast, when I get excited, please tell me to slow down. Okay, so again, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about needs assessment, maybe not a topic you have discussed much yet in the course so far. And I'm hoping that I can accomplish two things today. One is to give you a sense of why needs assessments is an important part of the product development process, and that secondly, that there is a process for this and it's an iterative type of work. Okay, so let's start out with some definitions. What do we actually mean when we say needs assessment? I think the terms conjure different meanings for different people. And for our particular Global Health Diagnostics Center, the main purpose of what we do when we do needs assessments is really to inform product development and then eventual product introduction. So it's really embedded within the product development process. So if you were to take this as just a framework for how you actually do product development process, we like to say that there are various types of needs assessments, or maybe even sometimes I might slip and call it market research, that you can do that would inform this process. They could be around problem characterization, market sustainability, economic rationale, or even policy environment. I've found that people, when they say needs assessments, could refer to any one of these things. And it really depends on what information is needed at what stage in the product development process. Most of the work that we're doing under the GHDX Center, and specifically under Core 3, which I'm leading, as Pat had mentioned, is around problem characterization. Doing landscape analysis, user needs assessments, really trying to drive at product specifications, and then also looking at the different concerns of various stakeholders. Okay, why should we conduct needs assessments? I'm going to take a little side tour into something called user-centered product design. I think you can all read this slide. And bottom line is we can't always rely on luck. So what is user-centered design? Well, it's a philosophy, it's a process, it's a toolkit, really. And it's really to ensure that developers, and I'm now talking to technology developers in the room, that they develop the kinds of products that actually meet the needs of their users in their particular environment. But why is it that very often things don't work out that way as we had all planned? Well, it's because people will say, well, it's because they, and I put this in quotes, they don't use a coherent process, and they violate simple rules about data creation and consumption of that data for decision making. I use they in quotes because it applies to all of us. It applies to us. Anybody can really fall into any of these traps. So maybe let's take a look at some simple rules that govern user-centered design. One is to match the system to the real world. That picture there of the stove, you will see, and it's really a pity I can't point here, but you will see that there are 4 knobs on top there and 2 other knobs on the side. So when I approach that stove, I have to stop and really think, okay, where does this map, like this knob maps to this particular thing or this thing or this thing? It's not immediately intuitive, right? And also this one on the side here, that's a picture of an elevator. Okay, you get in there, you want to go to the first floor. Well, you're probably, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go out here for a while, you're going to press here. That's the alarm. Okay, so I would bet you that most of the time in this elevator, they keep getting emergency calls. So you need to design a system that's really more around the user's language versus your own language. And use real-world conventions and think about a natural and logical order of things. The other simple rule is make things hard to misuse rather than possible to use correctly. That number 87 there, that's not the button you push to get gas. But you will see it has a very clean spot in the middle where people keep pushing to get gas. It's actually the little red one there which says push to start, which you can't see very clearly. Okay? Another example, make it easy to recover from errors, i.e., you should instruct users what they need to do to recover from the error that they had created. Another one would be to support redo or undo. This is an example of how you buy a ticket to take the metro. I think this is in DC. I see some nods in the... Wow, this is quite... If you've never used this thing before, it's quite intimidating to try to get anywhere. And I haven't actually personally used this, but supposedly if you press the wrong button, you have to start all over again. So errors should not cause catastrophes. It should just take you one step back, and you shouldn't have to start all over again. The other one that's really good to remember is using standards. When you see this sign, again, it's not really, I feel like I want to look up. It's not really clear what that sign is telling you. Okay, I think there are going to be people and bicycles on this road. There's a speed limit. I think that applies to the bike. And I'm not really sure what the up arrow is referring to. Okay. This one is the instructions of all the different features and benefits of a light switch. You tap once to preset. Since you can't read it, I'll read it to you. You tap twice for full on. You touch and hold to raise the lights. You push that little thing there off to the side to make the current level the new preset. Tap once to slow the fade off, so on. That's a lot of information to take in. There's a lot of thinking that you're asking your user to do. Again, and more on the thinking part is, and kind of interfaces with the design, is try to aim for minimal design. Because if you're presenting a lot of information to your users, the most important information can get drowned out. So the example there is of an alarm clock. It's a dream machine. I actually saw this in a recent hotel. I checked in and I was smiling. Because off to the side there is a little placard that shows you how to set your alarm. Okay, I'm checking in, it's close to midnight, I'm really tired, and the last thing I want to do is to learn how to set my alarm clock correctly. So what am I going to do? I'm going to call for a wake-up call for the following morning, right? And this other picture here is an instruction on different buttons on how to toast your bread. I think it's a little bit complicated, so, okay, so those are nice examples. I think we've come across many of those in our daily lives. So then the question is, okay, then how do you do user-centered design? Typically, it starts out with a premise or a question. Okay, I think there's an opportunity in coffee. Okay, I think people need a better coffee maker, for example. And I'm going to use coffee and coffee makers because it's something that we can all relate to immediately. But I do want to say that the process of user-centered design is a scalable process. Sometimes you have projects that are, tiny funded. You can do a certain amount, or if you have bigger projects, you can do more in-depth and iterative studies. But it is a scalable process. Typically, you start from some kind of an exploratory research project because maybe you're starting out from a completely new concept, or sometimes you want to do user-centered design in that process because you want to do little improvements to the products that you already have, either reducing cost or putting in new features to make it perform better. Okay, so on the front end of user-centered design, you may do exploratory type of questions such as ethnographic interviews, product placement or product concept evaluations, or even workshops such as participatory design. So here, for example, you might talk to a bunch of different people who like coffee, and they might give you these kinds of statements. So these are some of the needs that people express. But when you're doing this type of work, as much as it's important to capture what people say they need, it's also very important to be cognizant of their unstated needs. So let's take one of these as an example. Okay, I need coffee that tastes great. Okay, so how am I going to design a product around that? Well, the interviewer might say, okay, tell me a little bit more. Say, well, I want coffee that, excuse me, I want coffee the way I like it, not the way some other machine makes me have it. So then you might probe, if it goes, you might probe, okay, so how do you actually make your coffee now? And then they keep giving you more answers, which tells you, okay, first, their need is that they need coffee that tastes, so I need coffee that tastes great to me, not to some external standard, but to me. And as you keep probing in terms of how they're actually making the coffee, you get one particular scenario where they say, okay, well, I want the same cup of coffee every time I want it that way. Or they might also say, well, actually, sometimes I do like to change the way my coffee tastes to suit my mood. Okay? So now you have on top there is a need, that they need coffee that tastes great to them, and they also have just outlined two scenarios in which that need could be met. Okay, some definitions. Let me take a step back. So you have needs, which are, these describe the desired outcomes from the user's perspective. And then scenarios, and when I use this term, I'm trying to say that these are the instances where that need could be met, or should be met. And then I'm going to talk about product requirements, which really describe what the device needs to do in order to fulfill that particular scenario. And then finally, specifications, which describe the parameters of a particular requirement. And that will get clearer later. And so to those of you who have backgrounds in product development, the first two there, needs and scenarios, they sometimes get encapsulated in product development documents such as what we call user and market requirements document. The product requirements get captured in a, fittingly enough, product requirements document, and then finally the specifications in a functional specifications document. Okay, so yes. So how does the very front end look like? Well, again, if you're starting out from an exploratory research, you might start out with something like a qualitative study. Okay, you can do focus groups, you can do key informant interviews, even direct observations of particular processes that you're trying to solve. For example, you're trying to develop a new diagnostic test. Well, you might want to do a direct observation of the current practices that people are doing in that particular laboratory in order to identify what the gaps are. And you may also do product evaluations. You have a particular concept in mind right now, and you're trying to see what the initial feedback of the users are. So depending on the results that you get, you may either decide, you know what, I still have very key information that's missing, and I want to do more qualitative research. So you can either go back and loop into that and do more things like those, or you decide, I have sufficient information. Actually, my next question really needs more quantitative data, and you might switch to quantitative studies. And those could be using questionnaires, either in web-based surveys, telephone calls, intercepts. In market research, they do a lot of like mall intercepts, for example, or wherever places gather, and you can start getting random participation from the crowd. Again, the quantitative studies may actually raise more questions for you, or there's a particular theme or topic that came up and you don't really understand why. Say it's counterintuitive to you why you're picking one particular feature. You might want to go back and do qualitative research yet again to understand the reasoning behind those. But basically what I do want to say about this is that your research questions really should drive the type of method you choose. So later on, you might hear some people say, okay, well, quantitative research is really so much better than qualitative research, and there's always that debate and that controversy going on. But I think that's kind of a distraction. It's really what you're trying to understand, and based on what you're trying to understand, you will pick the best method that would address it. Okay, so to go back to our coffee example, so this is how, for instance, it would map out. The need is, I need coffee that tastes great to me. Scenario one is, I want to be able to get the same cup of coffee every time. And the other scenario is that I can change it to suit my mood. So for the first one, let's use that as an example. If you want coffee that tastes the same every single time, then the product requirements could be, one, the machine needs to grind consistently the coffee beans. Two, the machine needs to heat the water consistently. And 3, the machine needs to measure consistently. And that's how you're going to get the same cup of coffee every time. Or, and this is an or, the machine uses pre-packaged coffee. So you can start imagining, if you're a product designer, the path, the development path that you're going to take will start to diverge, right? There are 2 different product development pathways that you can take depending on which product requirements you decide to go after in order to fulfill that particular scenario for that particular need. Okay, so for example, under that machine measures correctly, or sorry, machine measures consistently, if that's the product requirement, then some of the specifications you may have for that would be, well, in that case, it could either do a mass measurement or it can do optical measurement. Okay. So before I move into the diagnostic example, I do want to thank a colleague of mine who helped me a lot with the slides, Kevin Flick from our Safe Water team. He's the one who is the source of these user-centered design slides. So then I want to, okay, so that's for the world of coffee. Now let's move to the world of diagnostics. Let's say my diagnostic example is I want to start with a premise or a question. I think there's an opportunity in a new diagnostic test for onchocerciasis or river blindness. And I'm going to take a side tour into what river blindness is, unless people here are pretty familiar with it. Are people very familiar? Okay, I see nods, heads shaking. So, okay, so what is onchocerciasis or river blindness? It's an insect-borne disease from the parasite Onchocerca volvulus. Here's a picture that unfortunately was very common for a long time, although it's getting much less common now, which is an older man who's blind being led by a younger person from the community. The parasite is transmitted by the black flies, Simulium damnosum, which I was told in Latin means damned fly, because it really, when it bites, it's very painful when it bites, and the actual bite can stay painful for up to 2 weeks. And they're very common, or they used to be very common in fertile riverside areas. And as a result, many riverside areas, which are prime agricultural land, get abandoned for fear of getting onchocerciasis or river blindness. So not only does it exact a huge toll on the people who are affected by the disease, you can also imagine that it exacts a huge toll on the country because your productivity drops. So it has a huge economic impact. And that's why they say that these onchocerciasis, like a lot of other neglected tropical diseases, are diseases of poverty. It's almost exclusively a parasite of man. I don't think there are known animal reservoirs of onchocerciasis. So why is it such a problem? Well, when you get infected by the worm, a lot of the symptoms revolve around the inflammatory response to the infection. So you get intense itching, you get skin rashes, and there are people who say that the itching is so intense that they can't actually sleep. So people are constantly fatigued, they have a hard time concentrating. And over time, there's the skin effect is that people scratch a lot, they get rashes, they get severe skin disease. Over time, there's depigmentation in that region. That's why it's also called leopard skin. And some of the worst effects of onchocerciasis is that it leads to blindness. Over years of infection, the microfilaria or the young worms, they are normally found in the subcutaneous region in the skin, but over time and over repeated years of exposure, they migrate to the eyes, and they're found almost in all tissues of the eyes except for the lens. And the inflammatory response when they die, the body's response to that causes scarring in the eyes, which eventually leads to blindness. So onchocerciasis, right now, there's only one treatment, which is with ivermectin. Brand name is Mectizan, currently being donated by Merck. And it's distributed through community-directed treatment with ivermectin, which is they use community-based for distribution of the medicine. The problem is that it only kills the microfilaria or the young worm. which means that you still have the adult worm in the body. So what does that mean? Okay, while you can get rid of some of the symptoms, the itching, and if you can keep giving the medicine consistently over time to the affected populations, then you can prevent blindness. But the problem is that it kills only the young worms. It does not kill the adults. So if you have one adult female worm, they can produce thousands of microfilaria per day. So you have to keep taking the medicine over a course of a very long period of time. We're talking 10 to 12 years. Basically, you're waiting for the adult female to die off so that then you're no longer infected. Okay, another point about that distribution, it's even though it's, you say it's in Africa, also in Latin America, and also in, actually it's also in Yemen, 99% of the disease burden of onchocerciasis is in Africa. Okay, so that's a quick blurb about onchocerciasis. So now let's apply what we've just learned about user-centered design on this and we say that we want to develop a new diagnostic test for onchocerciasis. When you start talking to different users, well, you might get certain types of statements like, okay, I need something that's less invasive than current tests. I need a test that works better than what I'm using now. I need something that I can use in the field. And it's something that tells me, for example, current infection versus past infection that can differentiate between those two. Let's take one of them, like I need a test that works better than what I'm using now. If you do more probing and trying to understand, okay, what are the particular circumstances where they're trying to use the test or where they feel that the current tests are no longer really that useful for them, well, you might come up with different scenarios. And I've put 3 here. One is that, well, one scenario is I can test for reemergence of infection. Say I've been treating a community for a long period of time. We think that transmission has been halted, and we want to be able to monitor that reinfection has not happened. So this is a test that we could use, and we need a test for this at this moment. Another scenario could be, well, I could use a test for monitoring prevalence of infection. Again, you're treating the communities, but it's a long-term treatment, and you want some kind of tool that could start measuring the prevalence of infection. It's not yet 0, whereas in the first scenario there, it's kind of a binary yes/no. Is there reinfection happening in a particular community? The second scenario is really trying to find out if you can measure and monitor the prevalence of infection. And the third is I can test for exposure or potential transmission. This came up in some conversations where people are saying, well, we have some areas that are hypoendemic for onchocerciasis, and we don't really know if there are pockets of hyperendemicity within this region, so we want to be able to have some kind of test that tells us whether this particular person has been infected, so maybe we should take a closer look there. That might be a pocket of hyperendemicity in the area. Okay, so those are certain types of scenarios that you can start building. If we take the first scenario, well, here are a few product requirements that you could look at. That it works during the pre-patent period. All that really means is that when you get infected by onchocerciasis, it takes about a year for there to be sufficient microfilaria to be in the skin. I forgot to mention, by the way, sorry, is that the current gold standard for diagnosis for onchocerciasis is to do skin snips. Literally, they cut pieces of skin, put it in saline, and they count how many microfilaria come out through microscopy. So really invasive technique and actually not very sensitive. And it takes about a year after infection before there's sufficient microfilaria in the skin to be able to be counted by this method. So they want something that, say, works during the pre-patent period. In that case, maybe the specification would be, well, maybe we can look at antibody-based tests to be able to work during this period. Going back to the pre-patent period, you might want to say, okay, I need an antibody-based test to be able to work in this critical period of time. I also need a fast turnaround as a product requirement. And the specification could be 20 minutes or less, and so forth. I mean, I don't need to go through all of this, but this is basically just to demonstrate how you can use this particular way of thinking to capture all the different requirements and then also start specifying the different parameters that's required to meet that requirement for that particular scenario. Okay, this is in your handouts, but here's a list of some of examples of product requirements. Again, if you're a technology developer and you're trying to design products, you can basically use this as a checklist. Is this something I need to consider, like the number of steps for this test, or the training that I need to do, or the different kit components? Do I need to supply a Lancet with this? And all of this depends on who your users are and where they're trying to use the diagnostic tool that you're developing. Okay, so how do we go back to the original question of how do we actually want to do needs assessments, okay? So let me use an example that I have some familiarity with that we've been doing for a number of years now. We want to start out with a premise or a question. And our statement is, well, we think that a point-of-care multivalent diagnostic test could be useful in the management of acute undifferentiated febrile illness in children. So that's our starting point, okay? And then we say, and by the way, what we mean by a multivalent test is a diagnostic test that's capable of analyzing a single biological specimen for multiple pathogens. So if that's my starting premise, and that's where I want to start doing my needs assessment on, the first part then is to be really clear as the purpose of your study, which is what are the ultimate goals of your needs assessment study? Why do you want to conduct it? What are the issues that you're actually trying to explain or illuminate? Are there particular processes that you're trying to influence? And are there decisions that you need to make that are pending the results of this needs assessment? And also, why should others care about the study that you're doing? Why is it even worth doing in the first place? So those are things that you need to clarify to yourself as you start out the purpose of your study. Another element of your study design should be your conceptual framework. Typically, you're not walking into one topic completely blank slate. Typically, you have some ideas already in mind. You've done literature research, you've talked to a bunch of people. So you might have already a conceptual framework in mind, which is really your hypothesis. So you need to clarify your hypothesis and try to think about, well, what do you think is going on? What kind of literature, preliminary research, even personal experiences will you draw upon? So for example, for us, when we're looking at the point-of-care multivalent test, we have certain assumptions of what are the kinds of product features would be important to users. I think portability is really critical for the following reasons. And I think that people, in terms of what diseases they want on any kind of multivalent test, well, I think the key drivers for healthcare providers would be the prevalence of the disease, how contagious it is, the sequelae to the patient if you have misdiagnosis. So I think those are the key drivers for any choice. So you want to start mapping those, saying, okay, I think this is what's going on, and I'm going to design my study to see whether this is really what's going on. Then finally, because you've clarified what you think is going on in the situation, you can then start writing out your research questions. Again, what do you want to understand by doing the study? What are the things that you do not know about the things that you're studying? And also, what questions your research will actually attempt to answer. So again, as an example, on the point-of-care multivalent test, we've distilled down our research questions to the following. What are the target febrile diseases in children that are desired by healthcare providers in a point-of-care multivalent test, and why? What are the current clinical practices in the settings that we're interested in, and how could a new tool fit in these practices? What are the different design features that are most important to potential users, and why? What are the advantages? And what would hinder the accessibility and usability of new tests? You notice also that I highlighted what and why and how. Because since those are my research questions, and I already said earlier that your research questions drive the choice of methodology, or the choice of methods that you use, because we're interested in understanding what, delineation, and also why and how, we ended up using both qualitative and quantitative methods in our study, okay? So typically you hear people call that a mixed methods approach. But again, depending on your research question, it could be qualitative or quantitative, your approach. then you also, and again, I'm putting this here as, again, as checklists that you can use in case you do want to do your own needs assessments. You need to start thinking about what your sampling plan would be. For us, we decided to do purposive sampling, which means that we have an eligibility criteria as to who will be part of the study and who will not be part of the study. We have a criteria for our site selection, and we have rationale why we chose these particular sites and why not others. And there are other types of sampling that you can do. Some folks say you can do snowball is another technique that people use, which is basically I interview you and then I tell you, well, who do you think, who else should I be speaking with? And you can get referred to other people. Those are also valid sampling techniques, but you just need to know what your sampling plan will be. And of course, if you're doing work in different countries, you have to think about language and the QA around the different guides that you use. So for us, we took English. We worked in the English version first, translated into Tagalog, which is the language in the Philippines, in the National Capital Region, and then we back translated it again to English for quality assurance. Training is another component to think about for your needs assessment study. Those different icons there are things that you should take into consideration when you do training. And when I mean training is that typically when we do these studies, it's very hard for us ourselves to personally go out and interview hundreds of people. So we may have to ask for other groups to join us in the effort. And training is often overlooked, but it's really critical because the data that you get is only as good as the interviewers that you end up working with. And it's also ideal, if it's possible, even though you might have picked your 5 interviewers, it might be good if you can train for redundancy, because typically we're in certain field settings where you can go in and out only once or a very short period of time. If you lose any of your interviewers, it's good that you have backup interviewers. It's also good not to take for granted the interviewing skills of the people you work with. So a refresher, if they already have done it before, or start de novo from the beginning if they don't have that experience. And field management of data. I'll show you an example of what we mean by that. So here, actually before I go there, for field management of data, or actually data collection, ensure that you have sufficient time. This might sound so obvious, but ensure that you have sufficient time to actually collect the data, and also the timing of that data collection. For our work in the Philippines, for a number of reasons, we ended up getting delayed, and we ended up actually doing data collection during the typhoon season. So while we were there, we had 2 major typhoons happen. I think about 90% of Metro Manila region was underwater. Of course, we were the last priority of any healthcare worker that we're trying to talk to, which is very understandable. And there was also right after the flooding, there was also a leptospirosis outbreak. So timing is important, and then having a sufficient period of time to actually conduct the research. Around data management, let me show you an example of what we mean by that, and that's why it kind of goes back to the key importance of training and making sure that everybody is on the same page regarding field procedures and expectations. So for example, this is how we did this work in the Philippines. We have the interviewer. After they've done their 2 or 3 interviews at that day, while they're still in the field, they're supposed to take their field notes, transfer all of the information onto a clean interview form so other people can actually read their scribbles. Because we're doing audio recording of the interviews, we also ask them to do a transcription of the open-ended questions from the digital voice recorder, and then they're supposed to report any problems immediately to the study coordinator in the Philippines. And then every 2 to 3 days, they're supposed to meet with the study coordinator that's based at RITM. They're supposed to transfer all of the clean forms they have to date, as well as all of the digital recordings. And then those go with the translation team, who will then translate all of the documents, goes back to the study coordinator for data entry into a database. And at the end of each week, we expect that that particular study coordinator was going to email back to the Seattle-based research team the database, all the digital recordings, and also all of the status updates on our recruitment efforts. So making sure that everybody really knows the procedures is critical to this. And of course, oh, and I forgot to mention that since it's very difficult for them to actually send us the paper copies, even scanning, it's huge. We ask that all of the paper forms are secured in a secure location at the study site. And at the end of the project, all of those paper trail will be destroyed. Our previous speaker mentioned quality assurance as being very important in the lab. It's also very important in this type of work. So for us, we had to institute quality assurance around the transcription to make sure that the interviewers, because they're really, really tired, they've had a long day, that they're not taking shortcuts in how they're doing transcription. The translation team itself, we needed to make sure that the translation really captures the intent of the interviews, and also for the data entry. So we have 3 QA steps.
Why would you want to destroy the interview data?
Part of it is in the ethics approval process. Many we're advised that many groups don't like data kind of just floating out there. I mean, the information has already been transferred electronically in the database, so there's really no need for the hard paper to sit somewhere that could be unsecured at a later time. So you do need procedure. You need, as part of your study protocol, for example, when you submit to ethics approval, you need to delineate how you're going to destroy the data at the end. So you maintain the anonymity and the confidentiality of your study respondents. Exactly. Even though we also still use ID instead of the original, it's just much better that way. Okay, finally on data analysis. Okay, so the big lesson learned for me here, especially as we move to bigger and bigger studies, is that the time needed for data analysis is often drastically underestimated. You need to have an analysis plan up front. So as you're designing your questionnaire, your forms, you need to already start thinking, okay, how am I actually going to analyze this data? Because it may impact your actual form and how you collect the data and how it's going to the database and so forth. Again, your databases, you might have 2 types of data, qualitative and quantitative, and there are different databases for that. For qualitative data, you can either do manual coding, or now there's better and better software for doing electronic coding, which is so much nicer. And also during data analysis, QA is still important. So for us, for instance, while you had people doing coding on the narratives, we actually had 2 independent researchers doing that, and then they come together to see whether the coding matched and whether they came to common themes. And then also we did 10% QA in all of the transcripts. Okay, so it's a lot of information that I've thrown out so far. And again, most of the things I put here are really just like quick blurbs, and you can do check-off points there if you're designing your own needs assessment, and you can do further reading on any one of them. But the 4 bullet points that I do want you to walk away with today is 1, in needs assessment, it's not rocket science, but there is a process you can follow so that whatever you actually do end up answering your original research questions. Secondly, your research questions is critical. Be very clear about what you're trying to accomplish, because that drives your choice of methods that you're going to use in the field, and your sampling plan and your budget and everything else that comes after that. Because I come from the product development perspective, it's really critical for us when we do this type of work that we can actually make decisions based on the result of our research. We're not aiming to do a needs assessment so that we can publish it and say, okay, here's the situation in X. That's very nice, and that's useful information, and many groups do that. But for us in particular, we need it to feed into the product development process. So, for example, what I mean by that, if I do a study where I ask a particular new intervention or health technology that we're developing, we say whether was that acceptable to you or not. And I happen to have done a quantitative work where they have a Likert scale, yes, no, 1 being not at all acceptable, 5 highly acceptable. Let's say I get a lot of responses that are not acceptable, but that's it. As a product developer, okay, I know it's not acceptable, but it doesn't tell me what I need to do next to be able to get at that. So So be very clear about your research questions, your choice of methods, and that you can make decisions off of the results of your study. And then finally, it is an iterative process, needs assessments. Both when you are designing the study, so I mentioned to you the different the different components. Sometimes you need to work on one and then move to the other and move to the other and move to the other, because all of them really interact. They form a coherent interacting whole, especially when you have to stay within a particular tight budget. Because you might have a particular question first, you have a particular question first, and you say, I'm going to use this particular sampling plan, this particular methodology, and then you crunch the numbers, and you're like, shoot, this is 4 times my budget. So you have to kind of keep repeating that until you're able to design the study that still addresses most of your research questions, but staying within the budget. And then the last is that as designing the study is iterative, even carrying out the studies themselves is iterative. And what I mean by that is, to go back to the original slide I showed you where I had arrows up, really any of these studies may be iterative, because I may do an initial problem characterization where I just focused on, say, a landscape analysis. And based on those results, I might say, okay, you know what? I still need more information here. I might do yet another problem characterization. And similarly for the other areas there. I think somebody had asked earlier about cost effectiveness. You may be able to do that too, because maybe you've done it in one particular country and you say, you know what, that's not enough information for us. We need to talk to other stakeholders. And you might do iteration of that. And you can do any of these studies really at any stage of the product development process. It is linked to the product that you're trying to develop and move down the pipeline. And I think that was it. That's the last slide. So thank you for your attention.